Good morning. Welcome to Hudson Institute. My name is Rebeccah Heinrichs. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson and the director of our Keystone Defense Initiative. Today, we're going to discuss the concept and the dynamics of escalation. The United States is in an era of significant danger. The US-led international order, which America and its democratic allies and partners have maintained since the Second World War, is really more concretely understood as a US-led system of alliances. This system of alliances has brought about untold economic prosperity, freedom, and security, all principles that we here at Hudson Institute seek to analyze and to come up with policies that policymakers can then implement to maintain and strengthen the system of alliances that have brought about economic security, prosperity, and freedom both to ourselves and to our allies. But with this rise of authoritarian countries and this access, their increasing collaboration between these authoritarian countries, the current US administration has sought to deter these adversaries and then also regain deterrence once deterrence has begun to crack. But you hear a lot from US officials about this fear of escalation, and so US officials, for instance, are only willing to do certain things to help allies and partners like Israel and Ukraine for fear of adversaries, shared adversaries, escalating further. And so really the subject, I thought, warranted a more serious analytical treatment and study. And so I had some great friends and colleagues from across other think tanks as well to tackle the subject of escalation, to look at it very seriously, analyze it, and then present some conclusions to see if we can better inform policymakers about these concepts. And so that was really the idea behind this booklet that we are here to discuss today. And so with me, I have two good friends who are going to talk about their respective essays. First, we'll have Matthew Costlow, who is a senior analyst at the National Institute for Public Policy. Matthew's areas of expertise are nuclear deterrence, missile defense policy, arms control, and Russian and Chinese nuclear doctrine. His work has been published by Comparative Strategy, Strategic Studies Quarterly, and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. He's also published in many other places. He's very prolific. You should follow him on X for great real-time analysis about what's going on in the world. From 2019 to 2021, Mr. Costlow served as a special assistant in the Office of Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy at the Department of Defense. He was also very, very helpful for the Strategic Posture Commission, which I had the privilege of serving as a commissioner. And so we owe our gratitude to Matt for his great help and analysis to produce that bipartisan support. We also have Ryan Tully. Ryan is a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute, focusing on nuclear deterrence, missile defense, space policy, and European security. From 2021 to 2024, Mr. Tully was a professional staff member for the House Armed Services Committee and led the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. As such, he was responsible for all the issues related to the triad modernization, missile defense, arms control, and space. From 2018 to 2021, he served on the National Security Council, most recently as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs. In this capacity, he was responsible for coordinating all U.S. government policy towards Russia and Europe, and was the White House lead for U.S.-Russian arms control negotiations. Prior to assuming this role, he was Senior Advisor for Arms Control and Deputy Senior Director in the Weapons and Mass Destruction Directorate at the NSC. So I'm very thankful that I have both of these gentlemen here today. Our friend Kyle couldn't be here, unfortunately, but I do commend to you his essay also published in this compilation. But the way we're going to do this morning is I'm going to turn it over for each of them to just summarize of some of their conclusions in their essays, how they approach the subject, and some important things that they think maybe we're getting wrong that we need to think about more clearly. And then we'll engage in a conversation about some of the things that I pulled out of their essays, found commonalities among the four of us. And then we'll hopefully turn it over to some questions from the audience, and then we'll wrap it up here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rebeccah, and thank you to Hudson for hosting this event. I would note it's one of the only events that is speaking on escalation right now, and I think that's wholly commendable for such an important topic. And one day, hopefully, we find it doesn't become the most important topic, but we're not there yet. So my essay focused on escalation as a concept, what we think about it in terms of U.S. nuclear posture, missile defense posture. What does it take to cease escalation, to deter escalation from occurring, to bring it down if it does occur? And I think that you sort of have to start with the threat environment. The threat environment itself, very dynamic, not looking great in terms of the actual nuclear threat we're facing. The one threat that I sort of focused on is sort of an all-encompassing one. It sort of sounds like cheating, but it's really just sort of reality. And that's opportunistic and coordinated aggression. Now, everyone is familiar with Russia and China, how they're building up, how they use coercive nuclear threats in order to gain leverage in crises, to advance their revisionist aims. What I think people are less familiar with is how they are combining their military forces, their political forces, to try to advance some of their shared goals. They're not always together on every policy, but I think you are seeing an increasing willingness from both of their leaders to join their political voices together. And I think, in my opinion, Russia's nuclear threats in the Ukraine war right now are a bit of a foretaste for what we're going to see coming further down the line, and it's going to get worse. I think Russia, with its, even if it reconstitutes its conventional army, it's going to focus even more on nuclear weapons because it's seen what its conventional army can't do, its nuclear threats can do, and that is block Ukraine aid, some of the weapons that might hurt Russia the most. Those nuclear threats are effective in that. It's something their conventional army can't do. So one of the things I worry about is one of the lessons they learned from this conflict is rely more on nuclear threats early and often. I also believe that China is watching this same dynamic, and I believe they are also potentially learning that same threat manner. When you look at what China does with its conventional forces, what it does with its non-military but military adjacent forces in the South China Sea, I think it becomes clear they are very comfortable issuing coercive threats. Certainly with conventional forces, I don't see much hope that they will be restrained in their coercive threats with nuclear forces. So Russia and China separately, bad enough. Together, they present this threat of opportunistic and coordinated aggression. And I think I wish we taught geography more in high school and college, because when you really look at the two theaters that we're thinking about here, Europe and the Pacific, they couldn't be more different just topographically, but also just distance-wise. And the way the Russians and the Chinese are threatening our ability to project power, it's one of the most dangerous dynamics that we have. The way the US defends its allies is surging them forward from the homeland, all of our troops to certain ports, from those ports to our allies. Russia and China know that, and because our homeland is vulnerable to missile attack from Russian and Chinese missiles, they are basing their coercive strategies on that missile-based threat. So once you have that kind of accurate picture of Russia and China as coercive actors, they're used to coercion, they talk fluently with coercion, even to their own people. A US that is not fluent in coercion, we are not comfortable talking coercively, we're not very comfortable taking coercive threats. That leads you to say, okay, we need a top-down approach in how we size and posture our forces. So I start at the highest level of the escalation ladder, and I know that won't be my only reference to Herman Kahn in this talk here. But I think you sort of have to start first with the most stressing scenario. The most stressing scenario is a preemptive strike from Russia as they are the largest arsenal. And then we have to be able to survive that, achieve objectives after that strike, and still have remaining forces to deter China. That is an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially because after a nuclear war, we are going to look weak, we're going to have far fewer nuclear weapons, our government may be in tatters. The incentives for opportunistic aggression at that point are going to be very high for a place like China that has shown itself to act opportunistically when the moment arrives. So perhaps we can talk more about the actual programs that might entail in the Q&A, but I think you have to start there. We have to size and posture our force such that even a preemptive strike cannot take out enough nuclear weapons, the ones that we need to survive, accomplish objectives, and deter even after that strike. The second place I looked at is the theater nuclear weapons. When you face adversaries that are bent on coercion with their own regional nuclear arsenals, they respond best, I believe, to threats in theater. And when they are threatening our power projection from the homeland, our forces are going to take a long time to spin up, get deployed, get settled in whatever allied country needs help, and then start fighting. The Russians and I believe the Chinese are going to start, if they haven't already, learning the lesson that you go very hard, very fast, present a fait accompli so that US forces don't even have the time to get there. And how do you do that? If your conventional force is maybe so-so, like Russia's, you use nuclear threats, maybe even potentially limited nuclear employment. In my mind, I'd rather not use the strategic forces that we need to deter that. I'd rather have in-theater forces that are much more better equipped, both time-wise and nuclear effects-wise, to present that inescapable conclusion to Russia and China that they cannot get away with regional aggression, especially nuclear-backed aggression. The third and final place that I looked at in my paper is what I believe kind of ties these threats together and how to respond to them, and that's US integrated air and homeland missile defense. Right now, we have 44 interceptors for a North Korean threat and essentially none against a Russian or Chinese missile-backed threat. I view this vulnerability as essentially inviting attack. We are looking at actors that like to use coercion, and right now they see a free and open highway right to the US homeland for a cheap shot. Pearl Harbor, if they think we are politically weak, militarily slow, perhaps this incentive is not something we should present to them. So one thing I advocate for is expanded US homeland integrated air and missile defense to take away that coercive threat, to raise the threshold of being able to strike the US. We want to make it harder for them to be able to strike, and then that allows us more freedom of action, even if they do strike, because it can protect some of the most important assets. The way I kind of like to explain it is, think of missile defense as a deterrent threat in and of itself, and it's also a deterrence enabler. It enables other deterrent threats. So by building this homeland integrated air and missile defense, you're actually presenting the worst of both worlds to the adversary. Not only could your attack fail, it doesn't reach its target, it doesn't hit enough targets, but it could actually invite the response that is just overwhelming. Those are two things now they have to worry about instead of just provoking an unacceptable US response. So I will leave it right there. I suppose I should end with another Herman Kahn quote, perhaps, is loosely quoting. He says, "We don't build our deterrent to survive an April spring day when even a frown could deter the adversary. We build our deterrent for the worst possible day: fire, thieves, snow, earthquake." That's how I think we need to approach deterring escalation. Is our forces may not be called upon it to do it now, but when they are, it'll be the most important U.S. mission.
Great. So I'm going to come back to, just since it's fresh in my mind, the point that you made about how missile defense bolsters deterrence. And one of the things that I like to point to, because we're watching it happen in real time, is because some people fail to get this, to understand this properly. So look at Israel and Iron Dome, the Iranian proxies. There is this belief, I've seen it sort of in media, people talk about how Israel doesn't have to respond to Iran because Iron Dome was so successful, and that will reestablish deterrence, to which I say, you're missing the second piece.
Yes.
So you intercept the incoming attack, so the adversary exhausted some military capability, so it's a cost to him. He also made that risk assessment that he's going to try to target the defender. The defender intercepts the incoming, but now the defender will retaliate and has the luxury of retaliating as though that the initial attack was successful. And that's how you exact a cost, impose a cost
Yes.
on the aggressor for his attack while protecting your people and your assets, and then convincing the adversary that was unwise and he shouldn't do it again.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, no, and if I could, it goes back to Clausewitz even, who said that the whole purpose of a good defense is to enable a good counter attack, right? And one thing, if we're talking about escalation here, is now Israel has seen what Iran's threshold was, right? Iran sent X number of missiles over. That gives them a data point to think about in how they're responding, right? If they didn't have missile defense, it would be much more difficult to tell, did Iran mean this as a medium attack, like a very large attack? So now they can appropriately respond however they want to.
So it gives the defender more, I think, breathing space.
Yes.
And to and frankly more control then to respond without being forced to respond in a particular way. If they didn't have the ability to defend themselves, they would have to respond in a more I think overwhelming way.
Or preempt.
Or preempt, and
which
so
is even worse.
And so it not only is it does it grant some measure of decision-making control to the defender, but it also has a stabilizing effect because
Yes.
you have more options. And that's really important because during the Cold War, the belief was that if you have a missile defense system that's too strong, that it'll create a destabilizing effect. But we actually have a case study showing to us again and again that from a strategy perspective, understood that there are different systems than the United States would have, or that the Russians do have, or that the PRC does have. But we are getting to learn something about the strategy and the effects of that capability.
Absolutely.
Great.
And they like to make a big deal about our 44 interceptors, but I mean, there are 68 nuclear-tipped interceptors don't get nearly the amount of same play that or attention that ours do.
Exactly. So our 44, when he says interceptors, are homeland interceptors that the United States has versus what the Russians have for theirs.
Just around Moscow.
Yep.
That's just around Moscow. So we're going to talk more about that too, I hope. But I wanted to make sure that we really stuck the landing on that point because I think it's so important and it's something that we are being gifted with a lesson here from how well the Israelis are understanding this, and we need to learn it because we're going to be unfortunately in a place where we're going to have to apply these lessons, I think, if we're smart. Ryan did a great job, I think, in his essay at zooming out and giving us a little bit more geopolitical context to see where we kind of got pushed on our back foot and we really haven't recovered. We've been reeling since, and that was the Afghanistan withdrawal. And then we've kind of moved on from there, and the U.S. government under the Biden-Harris administration hasn't been able to kind of restabilize the environment, and we've seen this kind of cascade of aggression since then. So Ryan, why don't you take us there and then move us into the Russians' calculations for their decision to attack Ukraine, and then what we've been getting wrong.
Yeah, well, I also start with that there's two important facets to deterrence and escalation, right? There's the hard power, there's the material, there's your investments in your defense spending, there's where you make the investments, there's having ammunition stockpiles. That feeds into deterrence and escalation. It lets the enemy know that you have the ability to respond, and that you have different options and methods for doing so in a very hard power type of way. But there's also the psychological aspect of deterrence. It's having the enemy or the aggressor know that there's the willingness to do it, and that you've shown that capability, that there has to be a understanding that they know that whatever price that they build in for their aggressive action, that what the response is going to be is going to make it not worth it for them. And during the Trump administration, we tried to do both of those things. One, we made the investments in places like NNSA and our triad and in the Department of Defense, and tried to build it up so that way we could actually, it wasn't a hollow force. It was a force where there was real capability behind it. And then two, on the psychological side, I mean, President Trump was willing to go up the escalation ladder in a much more aggressive, less predictable way than I think you're seeing with this administration, right? So if you go back, and the other thing I would say on the psychological front is nothing for free, right? Especially when you're talking about your adversaries or your enemies, right? If you give Russia, Xi, or Putin a freebie, what they're going to do is they're going to pocket it and they're going to move on to the next one. So I talked a little bit early on about how New START, 5-year clean extension right off the bat, that was a freebie. We were very much trying to leverage a New START extension for gains in the Russian
Theater range.
Say it again?
The theater range, their theater range, yeah.
The theater range systems, but also into their production capabilities, right? So get things that are more valuable for us for something that they obviously value, which is the strategic forces side. And so using leverage and using that to try and make sure that you don't give them something for nothing. And that was kind of our approach during the Trump administration. If you walk back to Ukraine, and I actually wish I'd gone back to 2014 to how it actually originally started and what the consequences were for that, because that actually played into it a lot, their ability or their thinking that they could get away with it again. There were a series of actions early on in the Biden administration, waiving Nord Stream 2 sanctions, signals that the defense spending caps would be held to where they were, and the New START extension as well, that they pocketed those and then they moved on. And when they smelled weakness in the water, which was Afghanistan, and they saw our allies questioning us, they saw our ability to hold alliances together, that's when they pounced. And that's when they started building up around Ukraine. And that's when they thought, hey, we can get away with it, and whatever consequences for our actions, it'll be worth it to get all of Ukraine this time.
And on that point too, I think it's important that people remember that the U.S. mission in Afghanistan was a NATO mission, and that is sometimes lost, because I know that I certainly heard from allies afterwards who were distressed at the direction the U.S. was going in various other parts of the world, so beyond Afghanistan. So, it's sometimes dismissed as sort of it's not a direct, there is no, I've heard the criticism, there is no direct connection between Afghanistan and the Russians, but to your point, Ryan, there's a psychological component. We're not all Vulcans. So we're people, and so we're looking at the psychological component, U.S. commitment to ally missions, communication with allies, and that certainly the message was that the United States was willing to abandon that, and then was pretty quiet about it for a few days. It wasn't very public in explaining from the highest levels of the U.S. government what the plan was, and so that really made our allies pretty nervous.
When I was in the Trump administration, we talked to allies about a lot of different things, and a lot of it was like arms control and stuff like that. But Afghanistan was always like number 2 or right there at the top of it. What's our policy going to be? And we had to have constant meetings with allies and partners to communicate exactly what we were doing there.
Right. And then I think there was several other things that led up to the decision too, and you've written about it. But the Biden administration put a hold on some of the approved foreign military sales to get into Central and Eastern Europe that had already been approved. So there was a delay on that as Russia was beginning to mobilize massive forces along the Ukrainian border. The administration tried a mix of threats, economic sanctions, if the Russians did decide to invade. But they also tried some carrots. They tried let's withhold certain things. We won't do certain things. We will withhold punishment. And then, of course, none of that convinced the Russians that it wouldn't be worth the cost, and went ahead and launched the invasion. And
if you kind of walk through the early months and weeks of the war, the different types of systems and the withholding of things until it was no longer seemed as escalatory, right? So early on it was javelins and stingers, we can't provide that, and then after a couple months, javelins and stingers would finally go, and then you'd get to the HIMARS, and that's going to be escalatory because that can actually strike deeper into Russian territory or hit Russian forces in a more strategic sense. You can finally get over that, and then you hit the F-16s and other things, and so they eventually got to the right place on a lot of these systems, but 3 to 6 months too late, and after the Ukrainians were trying to plan counteroffensives, right? So it's kind of hard to do military planning when you don't actually know what kind of forces you're going to be able to bring to bear.
Right. In other words, the calibration has essentially granted escalation control to the Russians, because as the Russians escalated, we being the United States government, permitted the Ukrainians to match that and then stand down.
And to Matt's point earlier too, we've throughout this whole early months of the war was a strategic forces exercise on behalf of the Russians plus nuclear threats, right? So that's part of the playbook that you'll see if there's a South China Sea scenario coming. It'll be woven throughout.
Okay, great. So Matt, I want to get back to this, coming back to the concept you mentioned, the U.S. ability to project power abroad, and that's necessary. So when we say project power abroad, we mean U.S. troops specifically, but we also just mean our ability to get certain hard power systems into theater beyond even just manpower. We're talking about being able to send warships into international waters. That we often will take those things for granted, that we have the ability to do that, but we have the ability to do that because of the backstop of our nuclear forces. And so we have to get that part right. So let's talk about that. So you have the nuclear triad, and then you said that you prefer not to threaten sort of our highest levels of violence with our nuclear weapons against what Russia, for instance, could do in theater with a lower yield nuclear weapon, because we want to have theater nuclear weapons to build out that escalation ladder. Can you talk about why? Connect those things for us.
Sure. One thing that the previous commander of U.S. Strategic Command, Admiral Charles Richard, he likes to say that deterrence constitutes a withheld threat of escalation, right? That means in regional contexts, we are operating at a regional level. Perhaps it's only conventional at this point. There's still that withheld threat that we could employ nuclear weapons, but that works in reverse also. The adversary can have that same threat, right? We are withholding. It's a classic deterrence threshold. We don't want to cross the nuclear threshold, but if we have to, if you force us to, whether through its overwhelming strategic forces, whether it's employing a limited nuclear weapon, whether it's employing biological weapons, right? You need to be able to calibrate your response such that it changes the adversary's perception of what was going to happen, what kind of costs they were going to bear. One of the quotes I use is one from Colin Gray, and he liked to describe our strategic nuclear forces as the top cover or the foundation, which sort of sounds like a mixed metaphor, but he was British, he could kind of get away with that sort of thing. But essentially it was, if the threat that you are making can be trumped at every level, all the way up to general nuclear war, then your threats won't work, right? You have to be secure at the highest level of violence so that your adversary doesn't feel that they can just out-escalate you at each level. There has to be a, this is impossible, we can't go there section of the escalation ladder. So that's how I think they're all connected, is you have to be secure at the highest level, deter that gives you more freedom of action at the lower level.
But then what's implied in that is that you actually have to be willing to be forward-leaning to threaten the adversary at those lower levels of violence so that, one, they don't ever cross that initial act of aggression you're trying to prevent them from. But if they do, you have credible options to sort of push them back.
Right. And one of the things we should all be worried about is Russian and Chinese perceptions that they may have a greater stake in whatever conflict it is. I think especially of Taiwan. China thinks of Taiwan as its, seceded little brother. It's their territory in their mind. And so a foreign power like us coming to help Taiwan, to them, it's nothing short of treasonous, really. So when your adversary believes they have the greater stake, and maybe when they think you are militarily weak at the beginning of a conflict, maybe we don't want to get into a protracted conflict where the US can bring all of its industrial might to bear. But if they think they can get away with it with a fait accompli and have greater stake, then for me at least, that means we need to have a theater force posture and missile defenses that are just inherently credible as a response to that. Here's the great thing about missile defense. It's 100% credible that you're going to use it. No adversary says, they would never use those missile defenses to defend themselves, right? With nuclear weapons, there's always a chance, will they really use it, right? So one of the ways we get over that stake problem is having these higher credibility systems that we employ.
And we kind of recognize that in the Trump administration in two ways. One, after years and years of cheating on the INF treaty, we held them accountable, and President Trump pulled out of that treaty, and we started developing a lot of these systems on our own, these mid-range type systems that we were at a disadvantage of and didn't have, and now we're starting to see those come online. MRC is just one example of things that'll be very useful in a European exchange, but also be very useful in a South China Sea exchange. And two, development of the sea-launched cruise missile, right? SLICM-N was something that was started during the Trump administration. Biden folks tried to cancel it. Congress kept it alive. And now we're actually seeing some real progress, real money going behind it. And I think you're seeing the Biden folks now come to embrace some of these things. Yes. Some of these new capabilities, some of these things that they think that they'll need to allow the commander-in-chief to go up the escalation ladder, particularly in a theater scenario.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk about that here. You say, I'm quoting from Ryan here, once the conflict began, the conflict being Russia's invasion of Ukraine, America's fear of escalation led to a cautious, incremental approach to supporting Ukraine. This strategy has inadvertently prolonged the conflict and may have increased the long-term threats to European and global security. So and you make the point. It's not. We're not saying that the answer is recklessness. That you shouldn't be. That escalation is a real concern because you don't have control actually over how the adversary responds. The adversary is making his own calculations. We're making ours. But it seems to be what you're saying though is that because the fear of escalation sort of was primary in our thinking, that has created the effect of giving the Russians greater confidence that they could keep pushing.
And you're seeing us, the Ukraine kind of battlefront right now. It's frozen in a lot of different ways. It's very hard for either side to make gains. You're seeing a little bit here and a little bit there. The Ukrainians about was it 2 months or so ago broke out a little bit in the north. Russians have taken a couple cities here and there. Because the Ukrainians didn't have the capabilities early on to be able to really push the Russian forces back before they got dug in, and before that counteroffensive last summer, you're now seeing a conflict where it's hard to envision either side making huge gains over a couple of months. And so that incremental approach of them not having the capabilities, them not being able to now even still not being able to strike strategic targets inside Russia is preventing, is kind of causing this wound to fester.
Yeah, and we didn't. You mentioned this a little bit, Ryan, whenever you talked about the unpredictability element of an actual U.S. approach towards some of these problems versus a very predictable. So there's another very common way of thinking about this is that actually having the United States constantly communicating what it will and will not do is responsible and stabilizing. But that has in fact not been the outcome. So in the beginning of and this is when Ryan was working in Capitol Hill, working in the Congress, when this was going on, so I don't know how much you can share with some of you don't have to share the internal thinking, but you can just speak for yourself. But I know that in the very beginning of the war, the Biden administration said, we will not provide real-time intelligence to the Ukrainians because we don't want to be considered co-combatants or co-belligerents by the Russians. And there was a big push by Congress to say, oh my goodness, we basically have the Ukrainians on like a 30-minute delay before we're sharing critical intelligence for them for being able to hit moving targets that are inside Russia. And so that was just one example. Then the administration stopped doing that. But we also said, again, to your point, we were not going to give HIMARS, we were not going to give Stingers, we were not going to let the Eastern Europeans send in Stingers, and we were advertising that. We were saying we won't do that, we won't do that. The Poles wanted to send in the MiGs. We said we're not going to do that. So talk about the communication and why that's not helpful when you're trying to prevent the adversary from escalating further.
And the one other system that we haven't talked about yet, but Matt gets to, is missile defense, right? Just the importance that missile defense has played in Patriot 1. Early on, this is too complicated of a system. They'll never be able to use it.
They being the Ukrainians.
They being the Ukrainians. It's too high end for them. And I mean, that allowed the Russians to strike strategic targets inside Kyiv and be able to terrorize the people and cause power outages and things like that. System that they could have had earlier. And to be frank, we've actually learned a lot about the ability of Patriot by actually having it in Ukraine, its ability to get after hypersonics. But also, too, the Ukrainians kind of kludged things together over there in a really interesting sort of way. And so we've learned a ton about how we could use those systems in how our soldiers and air defenders would use those type of systems too. So that's another advantage of allowing the Ukrainians to operate some of these things. They would normally be working a S-300 type of system or SA-20. Now they're operating Patriot, and they could tell you how one system operates versus the other. Insights that our air defenders didn't have prior to that. So I forget the question. I kind of answered the one that I wanted to.
That's great. Well, Matt, I can turn to you. The importance, though, of part of a strategy, if you're trying to convince the adversary not to do something, you often don't want to be overly clear about what you will and will not do.
Sure. Yeah. It's strategic ambiguity is a wholly good tactic. One of the for those who don't know, the Biden administration rejected, thankfully, a no first use policy. That was an idea that was being kicked around. There's a no first use light sort of policy called sole purpose. The only purpose for nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear conflict. They rejected that as well. And they upheld, to their credit, the longstanding US tradition of not detailing when we might not use a nuclear weapon except in extreme circumstances. And one of the great unrecognized benefits of that, I think, is that when you do want to become more specific, you can under a strategic ambiguity, right? You don't have to stay ambiguous all the time, but it gives it more power when you do suddenly say, we will use it at this point or we won't use it at that point. You're clarifying something for the adversary that they didn't have before. I think that gives it more weight. But if you start from a position of always telling your adversary, we will do this, we won't do this, quickly they're going to learn, well, we can manipulate this.
Well, let's take that into a example from just this week, right?
Sure.
When you're looking in the Middle East, the president said he does not support them going after Iranian nuclear facilities.
The
right?
Israelis.
The Israelis going after Iranian nuclear facilities in response to the ballistic missile attacks or other aggression against them. I mean, telegraphing that, I mean, you can make intellectually honest arguments probably on both sides of whether or not that's a good thing to do as far as actually going after those target sets.
Yeah.
What will he be able to accomplish? Will he be able to get it? Will it actually, there are arguments to be made on either side, but the telegraphing of something being off the table as a response, that allows Iran to bake that in, what they can and will not do.
Right.
So
they can move air defenses
Yep.
from nuclear sites to other critical sites if they want to.
So I want to, that's really important. So not only has the US government explained what, in many situations, especially in the beginning of Russia, Ukraine, what we will and we will not do for our partner being attacked on the Ukrainians. In the case of Israel, we've publicly said what we will not participate in and what we do not support. And so in both of those situations, even as well-intended as it might be to de-escalate and to persuade the adversary not to escalate further, the actual practical effect creates a hamstringing, a limitation on the country we really want to prevail, and it creates a clarification for the adversary, and we've seen them repeatedly take advantage of that and exploit it to their benefit.
Yep.
Is that a fair synopsis?
Yes.
Now, I think Matt's point is really important about the no first use policy. So that's our official U.S. Policy for our nuclear forces. The Biden administration chose not to embrace an official no first use policy, even though President Biden with Senator Warren were the two Democrat candidates for president during the primary before the election who said that they would embrace a no first use policy if they won. And thankfully, I think to his great credit, President Biden evaluated that when he got in there, realized there's too much risk to that. We're not going to create unintentionally an incentive for the adversaries to attack the United States or our interests, anything short of nuclear weapons, by embracing a no first use policy.
And our allies and partners, thank you to them for actually voicing your concerns about that. And I think you're actually still seeing some of the remnants of that debate going on in places like South Korea and Japan.
It certainly doesn't help that we officially kept it open. You know, in the nuclear posture review, we say, we being the Biden administration, I'm not part of it, but
You're an American.
I am an American, so
our government.
there it is. They do say we hold forward the hope that someday we could move to sole purpose. This is after essentially 20 years of our allies saying, please stop talking about sole purpose. Please stop talking about no first use. And so even with everything else going on in the world, we're still clinging to that.
And they being our allies, don't want us to embrace that because the United States extends our nuclear umbrella to many of our allies. And so they understand that if deterrence breaks down, it's most certainly going to break down in their neighborhood. And so that's where it's going to start. And so they want the United States to maintain a credible threat that we're going to keep all of our options open. And so the adversary should not think that he can get away with it simply by avoiding a nuclear use. Because you can still have a strategic attack with non-nuclear conventional forces.
Look at Seoul, South Korea. You know, how many miles from the North Korean border, right? Facing large-scale chemical, biological, potentially radiological, overwhelming conventional forces. And we're really going to say we won't use nuclear weapons unless North Korea uses them first. To South Korea, that they're facing a threat to their national sovereignty, their national existence. So it's not very reassuring if you're sitting in Seoul to hear US officials say, yeah, there's some things we just won't do for you.
Great. All right, we've got some time for questions here, so I want to get to any questions that our audience might have. Sir, in the back, if you can just.
You focused on the kinetic.
Sir, we're going to get you. Pardon me. We're going to get you a microphone so those online can hear you as well.
Oh, okay. You focused on a kinetic attack on the continental United States, but you really haven't mentioned a cyber attack potential or attack on our thousands of satellites in space. So, I mean, if I were the Russians, I might attack 1,000 satellites before I did an attention-getting missile strike on the U.S. So,
Thanks for the question.
Your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
So I'll a little bit because it fits to the no first use kind of policy that we were discussing,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So yes, right, that could be a catastrophic attack on the United States that causes, I don't know, airplanes to fall out of the sky or nuclear reactors to melt down at civilian plants, or whatever the attack is that could have mass casualties in the United States. We do not necessarily want to take off the table how we will respond to something like that. So it's a very valid point, yes.
Yeah, and one of the other things people kind of forget is for our satellites in space, we use them a lot to detect adversary missile launches, right? One of the things you don't want to do in an escalation scenario when you're trying to keep things tamped down, you don't poke out the other guy's eyes so he can tell whether your attack is limited or not. If you take out their eyes, you sort of have to assume this is an all-out attack, right? And that's one of the good things that I think a proliferated system in space can do. It has some resilience just in case they want to try something foolish like that. But again, you're right, it rises to the level of a strategic attack, even if thousands and thousands of people don't die necessarily, they're machines in space, but the effects are so great that it sure looks like a threat to our national existence.
So again, because I love being painfully clear so that we're all on the same page, and I think it's very useful, because this is so important what he just said. There is this, because really what we are doing, 40 years since the Cold War, we are out of practice at thinking about these things. And so some of our assumptions that US policymakers are operating on, and a lot of our military officers who went through military academies and training, we're so far away from thinking about the strategy and the policy that we're out of practice and we're making some mistakes. So I want to just clarify something that you just said. There is this idea among some experts that if an attack on the United States is bloodless, it's not as escalatory. So the point about an attack on satellites or a cyber attack, which might immediately not be a bloody effect, you're not going to immediately see harmed human beings, but the effect, certainly in the case of satellites, depending on what they hit, could absolutely, almost immediately, but shortly thereafter cause significant human suffering and casualties, depending on what they hit. But to Matt's point, if we, the United States, are the ones on the receiving end of that and they take out our eyes, if the Russians are listening or the Chinese are listening, please know that we might have to assume that that's only the first salvo in a much more significant attack if you're trying to prevent us from being able to see what you're doing. And so you should not assume, adversaries, that the United States, if that does happen, even if we're bad at thinking about this now sort of in an academic environment, if that happens, the real effect might be that you cause the United States to respond in a much more significant way, because we have to believe that there's more attacks coming. And so that's a really, I think, important point. And then just to stick with sort of public reporting on these issues, it's why it's so concerning when the Chinese launched that the FOBs, intercontinental ballistic missile, the fractional orbiting bombardment system that went all around the planet, the Chinese launched it. And then when the Chinese, when Congressman Mike Turner, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee in the House, really kind of tried to ring the alarm bells to let people know that the Russians are working on a capability that, should they deploy it, would violate the Outer Space Treaty. You can sort of deduce from there, and I'm not going to speak more about that, but you can sort of do a little bit of Googling and realize what that means in the consequences of a country that might put a nuclear weapon in outer space, and the effects and how intolerable that should be to all of us. And then cyber, of course, I would say the Russians were conducting cyber attacks on a massive scale before they invaded Ukraine. And if you remember, I think we memory hold a lot of this, President Biden sort of made his infamous statement where he publicly said, I talked to Putin and I said, if you attack these particular things, I think he said like 8 targets or...
This minor incursion, right? Wasn't it?
No, that was another example. The cyber attack was, there are certain targets that President Biden told President Putin that if he attacked those, there would be significant consequences.
The Geneva summit, yeah.
Of course, the implication is if you attack everything else short of those, we were not going to have a significant response. And that gets back to the misunderstanding escalation. But then the minor incursion was the same kind of idea that depending on the degree of the invasion of Ukraine, how the United States may respond, only incentivize the Russians to give it a go. Okay, another question. We'll get to you in a second, sir. Yep.
Thanks. John Moffat from the British Embassy. Hi. So two questions, if I may. Talking about deterring Russia, in the context of Ukraine, do you think that deterrence can be restored there? And just secondly, then looking at, kind of on that line, Russia's collaboration with China, can we deter that collaboration, deter against it? Or is that something that we'll have to factor into our kind of future deterrence planning?
I'm going to have you go first for that second part, if it's fresh in your mind.
Sure. I guess deter them from what in Ukraine is my question. Deterring them from going any further, deterring them from... So I mean, I think that they poured a lot of blood and treasure into where they've gotten so far, and absent a cost that can be imposed on them from going further, I think that they're going to keep at it for the time being, right? So that's where I think the election kind of plays in, and there's a lot of ambiguity what will come next and how that'll be responded to. And so I think that, yeah, and absent a change in the battlefield or the geopolitical stakes, the Russians are going to keep at it. You said you wanted to do the second one, Rebeccah?
No, Matt, do you want
sure.
to tackle that
No,
on China and Russia?
It depends on what you mean by deter Russia from cooperating with China. So we, about 6 months ago, we had the news story about Rosatom supplying highly enriched uranium to China to help their nuclear reactors, which supposedly wouldn't produce weapons-grade plutonium. U.S. is officially skeptical of that. Was there a chance to deter that particular action? Perhaps, maybe. I wasn't privy to those sort of conversations. On deterring the broader cooperation, I don't think you can deter two opportunistic actors who share a common enemy, which is the United States and NATO kind of secondarily for China. I think it's a marriage of convenience. It's growing stronger. I wouldn't call it an alliance quite yet, but it sure looks like an alliance in a lot of ways. And it's highly personalistic between Xi and Putin. We may not be able to deter their cooperation, but I think we can deter their cooperative actions, if that makes sense.
A couple things to keep in mind. One is that when China has historical claims on territory, they typically go after them. And right now, that there's a lot of Russian-held territories that China has historical claims to, and at some point, they will probably actually try and get some of those back, particularly in the northeast part of Russia. Two, there are more Han Chinese in Siberia right now than there are ethnic Russians. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but mainly because there's a lot of minerals and resources there. So yeah, I think you're seeing a kind of Putin become the little brother in this, and then the Chinese will probably continue to take advantage of the Russians. And we should point that out to them too, and like we're doing right now. The one other point that I would make is the Chinese are very upset right now that U.S. medium-range missiles are showing up in the Indo-Pacific. The only reason those are showing up is because we got out of the INF Treaty 6 years or so ago now, 5 years now. And the reason we got out is because the Russians cheated on it. If Putin was still adhering to the INF Treaty, I bet you we would still be in the INF Treaty, and these capabilities wouldn't be showing up in places like the Pacific. So the Chinese should be very upset at the Russians for violating that treaty and allowing us to catch up in that capability.
And just to be clear on that too, so it's something like 90+% of the PRC's missile force would have violated the INF Treaty. So they need that kind of range and capabilities, and they've been investing in it heavily. And so the INF Treaty restrained the United States. It was not having the effect of restraining the Russians. They were cheating on it. So President Trump's decision to pull out of that treaty freed up the U.S. to deploy these systems. And also now at the last NATO summit announced that we're going to be deploying some of them to Germany as well.
The one last point I was hoping to make is the Arctic, where you actually are seeing a little bit of cooperation between the Russians and the Chinese. I do think that there's a way to kind of drive a wedge there. The Chinese aren't an Arctic nation. They participate in the Arctic Council as an observer, mainly but the Russians are a member of the Arctic Council, and the Russians actually do have territory in the Arctic. And so what the Russians used to say to us, the silkworm does not survive in the Arctic.
If I may answer your question, so I am optimistic that the United States can enable Ukraine to have a much better outcome than they currently have right now. If I did not think that, I would not be so motivated to get us to think about this correctly and not continue to make the same mistakes. It is my view that if the United States continues to maintain its current approach, Ukraine will lose. Russia will gain a further advantage, and I think that Russia has a great chance at actually gaining beyond what it currently has. I think these recent announcements from the United States government of more kind of weapons to Ukraine, this slow drip, is not going to do anything that's going to change the battlefield to Ukraine's advantage. The operational restrictions that the United States continues to place on Ukraine to not be able to use U.S. systems to strike inside Russia is a recipe for Ukraine having even a worse outcome. What I am optimistic and still, I believe, being realistic about is the potential of if the United States decides to take a totally different approach, to be less predictable, and to enable Ukraine. We don't even have to tell the Russians we're doing it publicly. We can share with our good friends, the Brits. We can share this with the Poles and some of our other NATO allies who have been, I think, sportier in their willingness to support Ukraine versus some of our Western NATO allies. There can be a plan to enable Ukraine to do more with Storm Shadow, with some of the longer-range American systems that we can provide them, enable Ukraine to have some significant successes and to cause the Russians to consider the fact that this can get much worse for them. Then you create some interesting opportunities. Yes, probably it's going to end in some kind of diplomatic solution where nobody is truly satisfied temporarily, but it'll be a much better situation for Ukraine, and I think in the long run could enable Ukraine to finally expel the Russians totally and then have a much better future as part of the West officially. So I am optimistic that things can change. And the last thing that I'll just say with China and Russia, I wish the United States would kind of step back and look at the geopolitical chessboard with eyes afresh and see that we have a great potential with India to create an uncomfortable other data point for both the Russians and the Chinese to have to deal with. I think there's enormous geopolitical opportunity there. I'm just going to leave it there because I'll start saying things that I regret. But I'm very optimistic that there's great opportunity there. And it's going to include working with really muscular diplomacy with our allies and partners on what we can do together to create a complicated environment for our shared adversaries. This axis is against us all. We're going to hang together or prevail together. And so I just think we have to think more cleverly about different things that the Brits can do to create a problem for the Chinese and the Russians, the Germans, the French, et cetera. So great opportunity, yeah.
What is the appropriate escalation to response to the Russian escalation of introducing North Korean troops? Is this an opportunity to introduce European troops, not necessarily NATO, but European? But what is the appropriate response?
We have like 1 minute to provide something pithy to say to this. Great question.
I mean, so the hard part with me is I used to have access to all the intel, what was actually going on, and I don't know what the ground truth of what's been provided or what's actually there, so it's a little bit difficult to actually, without actually knowing, say what it is.
Yeah. If I've got something I was going to, I would just point, news sort of broke, one of my colleagues came in to tell me that the South Koreans, and it ties into the remark I just made, the South Koreans are now noting and want to collaborate in some fashion with NATO to say this is a problem for them as well as the North Koreans contribute to the Russian assault against Ukraine. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how much we can help now enable other allies and partners, maybe not who are immediately in that region, who could help us create and impose a cost for this kind of acceleration. Escalation, I think, is a fair, I think, characterization of this now bringing in North Korean troops to help Russia. So just to say, it's an important question. I think it deserves a response, but we need to start to think outside the box and to be able to create dynamics so that our adversaries are less certain about what the United States-led response will be and that we have credible responses, and that we have the political resolve to go defend. To Matt's point, this is really a battle of who has greater stakes. And I think this notion that the Russians have a greater stake in Ukraine is wrong from a US perspective. I think that the view that China has a greater stake in Taiwan than the United States, I think is wrong. But that's another panel, so that we can sort of talk about what's at stake for the United States and our allies. But I think getting that part right, from there downstream, it's going to create much greater political resolve and options for US and ally responses. Thank you all very much for coming here today. Thank you all for listening online. We will post the transcript, and if I can encourage you to tune back in tomorrow, if I can put a plug in for my own first and only book, and probably, almost certainly, the only one there ever will be. But I write about how the United States' nuclear strategy and our nuclear posture is compliant with the just war doctrine. So not only is it strategically sound, but it's morally defensible and imperative. So please do come back to join us tomorrow. Thank you all so much. Please join me in thanking these great panelists.